Herbert Hoover was an Iowa orphan and a complex political figure who became one of the most controversial presidents in American history. Herbert Clark Hoover, humanitarian, engineer, and later president, was born in West Branch, Iowa on August 10, 1874. He came from a modest Quaker family. He had a distinctive appearance with his round face and reserved demeanor. Hoover's early years were marked by tragedy and resilience. His father, a blacksmith and farm equipment salesman, died when Herbert was 6 years old. His mother, a school teacher and Quaker minister, died 3 years later, leaving Herbert an orphan at age 9. The loss of both parents shaped his character profoundly, instilling in him both independence and a deep sense of insecurity that would persist throughout his life. After his mother's death, Hoover was sent to live with various relatives. He spent time with his uncle in Oregon, where he worked odd jobs and attended business school. These early experiences taught him self-reliance and the value of hard work. Despite his limited formal education, Hoover was ambitious and intelligent. He was determined to make something of himself despite his difficult circumstances. In 1891, at age 17, Hoover enrolled in the newly established Stanford University in California. He was part of the institution's first class. His Quaker connections helped him gain admission despite his lack of a traditional high school education. At Stanford, Hoover studied geology and mining engineering, fields that would define his early career. He worked his way through college, taking jobs during summers and managing campus activities to earn money. He graduated in 1895 with a degree in geology. After graduating from Stanford, Hoover struggled to find work in his field. He took a job pushing ore cars in a mine in Nevada, earning $2 a day. It was hard, dangerous work, but it gave him practical experience in mining operations. His fortunes changed when he was hired by a San Francisco engineering firm. His technical skills and work ethic quickly impressed his employers. In 1897, the firm sent him to Australia to evaluate gold mining operations. Hoover was only 23 years old, but he demonstrated remarkable ability in assessing mining properties and improving their operations. His work in Australia was so successful that he was soon offered a position with a Chinese engineering firm. In 1899, Hoover moved to China to work as the chief engineer for the Chinese Bureau of Mines. He brought with him his new wife, Lou Henry, whom he had married just before leaving for China. Lou was also a Stanford graduate and a fellow geology enthusiast, one of the first women to earn a geology degree from the university. Hoover's time in China coincided with the Boxer Rebellion of 1900. He and Lou were in Tientsin when the city came under siege by Boxer forces. Hoover helped organize the defense of the foreign settlement, building barricades and managing food supplies. Lou worked in a hospital treating wounded civilians and soldiers. The experience was harrowing, with constant shelling and the threat of massacre. The Hoover survived the siege, which lasted nearly a month before international forces relieved the city. This experience gave Hoover his first taste of humanitarian crisis management, skills he would use extensively in later years. After China, Hoover's career as a mining engineer took off. He became a partner in a London-based mining consulting firm and traveled the world evaluating mining properties. Between 1901 and 1914, he worked in Australia, Asia, Africa, Europe, and the Americas. He developed a reputation as one of the world's foremost mining engineers. His expertise was not just technical but also financial and managerial. He could assess not only the geological potential of a mine but also its economic viability and operational efficiency. By his early 40s, Hoover had become wealthy through his consulting work and mining investments. He had offices in London, San Francisco, and New York. He was a self-made millionaire, having risen from orphan to international businessman through intelligence, hard work, and opportunity. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Hoover was in London. Thousands of American tourists found themselves stranded in Europe as banks closed and transportation systems broke down. Hoover organized the Committee of American Residents in London to help these stranded Americans get home. He coordinated loans, arranged transportation, and helped over 120,000 Americans return to the United States. This volunteer effort brought Hoover to public attention for the first time. It demonstrated his organizational abilities and his willingness to serve without compensation. As the war continued, a more serious humanitarian crisis emerged in Belgium. The German occupation of Belgium had disrupted food supplies, and the civilian population faced starvation. In October 1914, Hoover was asked to lead the Commission for Relief in Belgium. He accepted, setting aside his business career to focus on humanitarian work. For the next 4 years, Hoover managed the largest food relief operation in history up to that time. The Commission fed nearly 10 million people in Belgium and occupied France. Hoover had to negotiate with both the Allied and German governments to ensure safe passage for food shipments. He had to raise funds, purchase supplies, arrange shipping, and distribute food in occupied territory. It was an enormously complex operation that required diplomatic skill, administrative genius, and tireless energy. Hoover worked without pay and even contributed his own money to the effort. His success in Belgium made him an international hero and earned him the nickname the Great Humanitarian. When the United States entered the war in April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson called Hoover home to serve as United States Food Administrator. In this role, Hoover was responsible for ensuring adequate food supplies for both American civilians and Allied forces overseas. He promoted voluntary conservation rather than mandatory rationing. He encouraged Americans to observe meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. The term to Hooverize entered the American vocabulary, meaning to economize and avoid waste. Hoover's approach was remarkably successful. American food production increased while consumption decreased, allowing massive shipments to Europe. He managed this without the coercive measures used in other countries. His success enhanced his reputation as an efficient administrator who could achieve results through persuasion and organization rather than force. After the war ended in November 1918, Hoover continued his humanitarian work. He was appointed Director General of the American Relief Administration, which provided food aid to war-torn Europe. Millions of people in Central and Eastern Europe faced starvation in the chaotic aftermath of the war. Hoover's organization fed them, preventing a humanitarian catastrophe. He also organized food relief for Russia during the famine of 1921 to 1922, despite his strong opposition to Bolshevism. His principle was that food should not be used as a political weapon and that starving people should be fed regardless of their government's ideology. By the time his relief work ended, Hoover had been responsible for feeding hundreds of millions of people across Europe and Russia. In 1921, President Warren Harding appointed Hoover as Secretary of Commerce. Hoover served in this position for 8 years under both Harding and Calvin Coolidge. He transformed the Commerce Department from a minor bureaucratic backwater into a major force in American economic life. He promoted standardization of products, expansion of foreign trade, regulation of radio broadcasting, and development of aviation. He encouraged cooperation between business and government, believing that voluntary collaboration was preferable to government regulation. He promoted trade associations and industry conferences to establish standards and share best practices. Hoover's vision was of an associative state where government would facilitate and coordinate private sector activity rather than control it. As Commerce Secretary, Hoover also dealt with various crises and disasters. When the Mississippi River flooded catastrophically in 1927, President Coolidge appointed Hoover to coordinate relief efforts. Hoover organized rescue operations, established refugee camps, and managed the distribution of food and supplies to hundreds of thousands of displaced people. His handling of the flood relief enhanced his reputation as an efficient crisis manager. However, his treatment of African American flood victims was controversial. Black refugees were often forced into labor camps and denied the same assistance as white refugees, revealing the racial prejudices that Hoover shared with many of his contemporaries. By 1928, Hoover was the most prominent figure in the Republican Party aside from President Coolidge. When Coolidge chose not to seek re-election, Hoover became the natural candidate. He won the Republican nomination easily and campaigned on a platform of continued prosperity and limited government. His opponent was Democrat Al Smith, the governor of New York and the first Catholic to be nominated for president by a major party. The campaign was marked by religious prejudice against Smith and by debates over prohibition. Hoover supported the prohibition of alcohol while Smith opposed it. Hoover won in a landslide, carrying 40 states and receiving over 58% of the popular vote. It seemed that Hoover's extraordinary career had reached its pinnacle. He entered office in March 1929 with tremendous goodwill and high expectations. In his inaugural address, Hoover spoke optimistically about the future. He declared that America was nearer to the final triumph over poverty than ever before in the history of any land. He believed that the prosperity of the 1920s would continue and that poverty could be eliminated through continued economic growth and efficient administration. These words would come back to haunt him within months. The stock market had been rising dramatically throughout the 1920s, driven by speculation and easy credit. Many Americans had invested their savings in stocks, often buying on margin. Warning signs of economic trouble had appeared, but they were largely ignored in the euphoria of rising stock prices. On October 24, 1929, the stock market crashed. Panic selling drove prices down dramatically. After a brief rally, the market crashed again on October 29, Black Tuesday. Billions of dollars in value evaporated. The crash marked the beginning of the Great Depression, the worst economic crisis in American history. Within months, banks began failing, businesses closed, and unemployment soared. By 1932, unemployment had reached 25%. Industrial production had fallen by half. Thousands of banks had failed, wiping out the savings of millions of Americans. Bread lines and soup kitchens appeared in cities across the country. Homeless people built shanty towns that were mockingly called Hoovervilles. Hoover's response to the Depression has been the subject of intense debate ever since. The traditional view, promoted by his political opponents and later by historians sympathetic to the New Deal, was that Hoover did nothing while Americans suffered. This view is oversimplified and unfair. Hoover did take action, but his actions were constrained by his philosophy of limited government and voluntary cooperation. He believed that direct federal relief would undermine American character and create dependency. He thought that state and local governments, along with private charities, should handle relief efforts. He believed that the economy would recover naturally if business confidence could be restored. Hoover did take some significant steps to address the crisis. He called business leaders to the White House and urged them not to cut wages. He increased federal spending on public works projects to create jobs. He established the Reconstruction Finance Corporation to provide loans to banks, railroads, and other businesses to prevent further failures. These were unprecedented federal interventions in the economy. However, they were not enough to stop the downward spiral. Businesses cut wages and laid off workers despite Hoover's pleas. The public works projects were too small to significantly reduce unemployment. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was criticized as helping big business while ordinary people suffered. Hoover's biggest failure was his inability to communicate effectively with the American people. He was not a natural politician. His personality was reserved and stiff. He lacked the common touch that might have maintained public confidence. He made statements that seemed callous or out of touch, such as claiming that nobody was actually starving or that prosperity was just around the corner. These statements, even when taken out of context, damaged his credibility. He seemed to many Americans to be cold and uncaring, though those who knew him personally insisted he was deeply troubled by the suffering around him. His Quaker reticence prevented him from expressing his emotions publicly, which was politically disastrous. In the summer of 1932, Hoover's presidency reached its lowest point. Thousands of World War I veterans marched on Washington demanding early payment of bonuses that were not due until 1945. These bonus marchers, as they were called, set up camps in the city and refused to leave. Hoover eventually ordered the army to clear the camps. General Douglas MacArthur, exceeding his orders, used tanks and tear gas to drive the veterans out, burning their camps. The images of the army attacking veterans shocked the nation and became a symbol of Hoover's supposed indifference to suffering. Hoover's claim that the camps were full of criminals and communists was widely disbelieved. By the time of the 1932 election, Hoover's defeat was inevitable. The Democratic nominee was Franklin Roosevelt, the governor of New York, who promised a new deal for the American people. Roosevelt campaigned with energy and optimism, offering hope to desperate Americans. Hoover campaigned defending his record and warning that Roosevelt's policies would destroy American freedom. The election was a crushing defeat for Hoover. He won only 6 states and received less than 40% of the popular vote. It was a repudiation not just of Hoover but of his entire philosophy of government. The period between the election in November and Roosevelt's inauguration in March was difficult. The economy continued to deteriorate. Banks failed at an accelerating rate. Hoover tried to get Roosevelt to endorse his policies, but Roosevelt refused, not wanting to be associated with Hoover's failures. On Inauguration Day, March 4, 1933, Hoover left office as one of the most unpopular presidents in American history. His name had become synonymous with the Depression and with failed leadership. Hoover's post-presidential years were long and eventually somewhat redemptive. For many years, he was a bitter critic of Roosevelt and the New Deal. He believed that Roosevelt's policies were leading America towards socialism and dictatorship. He wrote books and articles attacking the New Deal and defending his own record. He was largely ignored, a forgotten man representing a discredited philosophy. During World War II, Hoover offered his services to the government but was rebuffed by Roosevelt, who had no interest in associating with him. After Roosevelt's death in 1945, Hoover's reputation began to slowly recover. President Truman, despite being a Democrat, recognized Hoover's expertise in food relief and asked him to coordinate food aid to war-torn Europe after World War II. Hoover, then in his 70s, accepted and once again organized massive relief efforts. He traveled to Europe and assessed food needs, drawing on his experience from World War I. This work reminded Americans of Hoover the humanitarian rather than Hoover the failed president. In 1947, Truman appointed Hoover to chair a commission on reorganizing the executive branch of government. The Hoover Commission, as it was called, produced hundreds of recommendations for improving government efficiency. Many of these recommendations were implemented. President Eisenhower appointed Hoover to chair a second commission in the 1950s. This work rehabilitated Hoover's reputation as an able administrator and elder statesman. In his later years, Hoover lived quietly in New York City at the Waldorf Astoria Hotel. He wrote his memoirs and continued to comment on public affairs. He lived long enough to see his reputation partially restored, though he never escaped the shadow of the Depression. He died on October 20, 1964, at the age of 90. He had lived longer after leaving the presidency than any president before him, over 31 years. Hoover's legacy remains controversial and complex. He was undoubtedly a man of great ability and genuine humanitarian impulses. His relief work during and after World War I saved millions of lives. His service as Commerce Secretary was innovative and effective. Yet his presidency was a failure by almost any measure. The question is whether any president could have prevented or quickly ended the Great Depression, or whether Hoover was simply unlucky to be in office when the economic collapse occurred. Modern historians have been somewhat kinder to Hoover than his contemporaries were. They recognize that he did take action against the Depression and that his philosophy of limited government, while inadequate to the crisis, was consistent with American traditions. They note that some of his programs, like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, were expanded by Roosevelt and became part of the New Deal. They acknowledge that Hoover was constrained by economic theories that are now discredited but were widely accepted at the time. Yet even with these qualifications, the verdict on Hoover's presidency remains largely negative. He was unable to provide the leadership that the crisis demanded. His personality and philosophy were wrong for the moment. He was a technocrat in a time that needed inspiration. He believed in voluntary cooperation when coercion was necessary. He trusted in natural economic recovery when active intervention was required. His tragedy was that the very qualities that had made him successful as an engineer and administrator, his faith in expertise and efficiency and voluntary cooperation, were inadequate for the political and economic crisis he faced as president. Perhaps the most fitting assessment of Herbert Hoover is that he was the right man in the wrong job at the wrong time. His abilities were real, as demonstrated by his success in every other phase of his career. But the presidency during the Great Depression required qualities he did not possess: political skills and emotional connection and willingness to abandon traditional approaches. Hoover represents a particular type of leader, the expert administrator who excels in technical roles but fails in political ones. His legacy includes both the great humanitarian who fed millions and the failed president who seemed powerless in the face of economic catastrophe. He is remembered today primarily for the Depression and for the Hoovervilles that symbolized his failure, which is perhaps unfair to a man who served humanity faithfully for decades. Hoover was in death as in life a man of contradictions, remembered for his greatest failure rather than for his genuine achievements and his lifetime of public service.